All right, folks, welcome to Art 267 Online, the second part of our 2020 spring semester. Hopefully, we will get through this and still learn some stuff, I hope. For this little talk, I'd like to start out with a review, as I mentioned in my previous introductory video, of the standard responsive web design approach. Since, as I mentioned, it's going to have been quite a while come this Thursday since we've actually been messing with code. I realize that it's pretty easy to forget this stuff. Hopefully, a lot of the basic stuff has stayed with you. But I thought it would be a good idea to review the standard responsive approach that we've talked about for a few weeks during the previous part of the course. And I thought, as I mentioned, the best way to do that would be to pick out an example. I thought maybe we could use the Swiss Alps page, as you see here. This is the complete desktop version, and I thought I'd go through and talk a little bit about how we put the original fixed version together real quickly, and then run through how I would put together the responsive version. So to begin with, I thought maybe the best thing would be to talk a little bit about the main ideas behind responsive design. By now, I think you should have a pretty good handle on those, but just to reemphasize, at least in its beginning forms, there are more sophisticated ways of doing things now. There are some new elements and some new properties, some new techniques that people have been using just the last year, even the last just 6 months. But for the most part, the basic ideas behind responsive design were the three major tenets: to set up responsive, flexible containers, to set up responsive, flexible media, including images and video and whatnot, and to use media queries. So those are the three main pillars of responsive design. And I think they're pretty straightforward. The container aspect we talked about. Basically, what we want to do with our containers is to set them so that they are squeezable, right? So that they accordion. And to do that, we set them to have percentages instead of fixed widths. So that's pretty straightforward. We're used to setting up our wrapper div, for example, so that it is already responsive and accordion-like. Assuming that we set the wrapper to have a max width instead of just a width, that means that the wrapper is not going to go beyond what we set the max width value to, but it will squeeze down. So we're getting a nice percentage effect simply by using max dash width on our overall container, which I usually use for most of my simple web pages. Now, of course, remember that width is the key. We don't really have to worry so much about height. Just as a general rule, whenever we're talking about web page work, height is really extremely secondary. It's really width that is the most important consideration when we're talking about how the web page looks. And it makes sense because if you think about a web page, we really have almost unending height. We can keep scrolling and scrolling and scrolling down, right? And we just get more and more height to our page. And the way that block level containers work is that they will automatically expand in the height direction whenever you add new content or whenever For example, a visitor might change the size of the font and make it bigger, expanding, the overall content area of the element. The element will just extend itself down vertically. And most people are used to that. Most people automatically these days know that they can scroll vertically. We never want to force people to scroll horizontally, though. So width is really something that is the most important. And it's not only just the containers that we normally want to think about in terms of flexibility and setting them to percentages. We want to set the negative space as well. So if you have margins and if you have padding in the width in the horizontal directions, then those also can be set to flexible percentages in order to, make the page squeeze down at the same sort of a aspect ratio, you could call it. For example, if we had a wrapper div, let's say we had a wrapper div that just had a straight width of 1,000 pixels, okay? And let's say that we added padding to the wrapper div of 20 pixels on the left and the right sides. And 20 pixels, something that I oftentimes will add on the left and the right to my wrapper container. So how would we change that if we wanted to go responsive? Of course, first of all, the wrapper itself, we would change from a straight width to a max dash width, and that would automatically create kind of a percentage, sort of a accordion effect for the wrapper. And the padding for the wrapper, how would we handle that? 20 pixels of padding. Well, what we want to do is take the current value of either the padding or the margin and try to express that as a percent based upon the current width of the parent container. So if we are talking about the wrapper div having 20 pixels of left and 20 pixels of right padding, and if the wrapper div is 1,000 pixels wide, then to get the percent, we simply divide the padding 20 pixels by the width of the parent 1,000. And 20 divided by 1,000 ends up being 2%. 2% of 1,000 is 20. So we can change that coding from width equals 1,000 on the wrapper to max width equals 1,000. And we can change the padding on the wrapper from a straight pixel width of 20 pixels to 2%. And that will get us the flexible container and the flexible negative space that we might want. Now, the thing is that occasionally you simply have to look at your page. I mean, you've got to look at your page all the time, of course, but when you do look at your page, occasionally you'll see that you might not necessarily want or need to have everything set to percentages. Sometimes the padding or the margin is small enough and the width of the container is large enough, so it's pretty minuscule, the difference that you're going to find between setting things to a percent and keeping them as an absolute value is not really going to be noticeable. And if it's not noticeable, my feeling is why go to the trouble of changing it? The less code and the less modifications you can make, the better off you are. So let the page and the look of the page at various widths be the determining factor in letting you know in which direction you should go. The other thing that I remember mentioning a couple times in class was the fact that when I'm dealing with let's say a main column and an aside column, I oftentimes want to keep my aside as a fixed width, just because the aside is already considerably narrow and it may have some content in it that really would start to almost immediately look funny if it started to squeeze down as soon as the viewport got a little bit smaller. So oftentimes I will have my max width wrapper and I'll have a percent on the main element, but I will keep my aside element at a fixed pixel width. At least, up until the point when I think it's appropriate to have another media query, in which case I may, make a number of different changes to the general layout. But again, that's something that you can keep in mind. There's no hard and fast rules. It's not like you must always, turn everything into percentages when you're using responsive design. If you have a simple page, then a lot of times there's not anywhere near as much work that may be necessary as when you have a more complicated page. So now, as far as flexible images and flexible media is concerned, it's really easy to do. Just set the rule for your images and your media to have max width of 100%, and they should automatically become flexible. They will squeeze down and they'll maintain their own aspect ratio when they're squeezed. Now again, it's possible that your images will never get to the point where they're going to be affected by a resizing of the containers that they're inside of. So keep that into consideration. In this Swiss Alps page, what we are doing is using background cover in order to create a nice sort of a flexible effect for our large background image here inside the header. These promo images are so small, though, we certainly wouldn't want to make them any smaller than they are. So I wouldn't want to make these images flexible images. They're really very small to begin with. If anything, I would like to make them a little bit bigger. Now, in the past, I haven't checked this out, so I can't vouch that this is true for all browsers at the present moment. But in the past, the way to make your images either flexible or non-flexible was by adding or eliminating the width and the height attribute inside the IMG element. So in other words, if you wanted to have your images maintain their fixed width, even after having created a CSS rule that said that the width should just be 100% and essentially turn them into flexible images, if you put an absolute height and width attribute, as you normally would in your images, then that should refrain them from squeezing down. Now, again, I don't know if that's true these days in all the browsers, but that's how we used to do it, and I just haven't gotten around to checking that. Excuse me. So maybe you guys can check that out for me. Do a little test. Take some images and set them to 100% max width and leave out the width and the height attributes and see if they squeeze down, and then add the height and width attributes back and see if they stop squeezing. If you do that in various browsers, then you can report back to us about what you find. So anyway, that's pretty straightforward, though, and pretty simple to do. Now, there, again, are other advances in the realm of image that we'll talk about a little bit later. I think maybe when we talk about the grid, I'll bring up some of the new properties and values that you can use for images in responsive areas of your page that make things even more easy. But, trying to keep things simple. So the way we've been doing it up till now, I think, is probably going to suffice for most situations. The last pillar of responsive design, of course, is media queries. And like I mentioned in my little intro video, I remember people having some problems with media queries. I heard you guys saying that, you were having trouble getting them to work properly. It's, if you, I think part of the secret is to create cascading style sheet rules that are sensible, organized, and parsimonious. That's always a good beginning. So making your rules only for those things that you need to make a rule for, and trying to organize them in some order. Now, of course, I'm not the greatest exemplar of that, because you may often see me in class doing examples and I'm writing CSS, and sometimes I'm just sort of throwing it in there anywhere. I do actually, if you look, I do try when I have a half a second extra time to think, I do try to put things kind of in the order in which the elements are introduced in the HTML code. So I sort of instinctively try to do that. So you might find me putting body rules right up the top of my CSS, and then maybe rules for the wrapper right after that, and then rules for the header and for the H1 after that, and then maybe the nav, and then the main area, and then the sections in the main, and then the aside, and then the footer. So, I try instinctively, I think, to follow that pattern, but, when I'm in class and doing examples, I'm concentrating more on the rules rather than the organization. So don't necessarily follow my example. Most of the time, after I'm done with the page and ready to go live, I will go through and reorganize my rules and try to set them up so that they're more logical. But I think that's the first important step. And then it's a matter of just understanding how you should set up your media queries. And I know that there are a lot of, in the beginning, we had to guard against certain browsers that didn't understand media by adding these extra words, the and screen and everything. But nowadays, you don't need to do that. When you make media queries, just put the @ sign in the media, and then parentheses, put in whether you're using max or min width, a colon, and the particular value. And that's all you need to do. So, for example, I have an empty page here, test page. So if I were thinking about media queries, I don't have anything on this page, but, if I were putting media query in here, I'd just go @ media, and then just say, max dash width, 775 pixels or something like that. And and there you go. That's all there is to it. Just @ media space, parentheses, max dash width or min dash width, colon, 775 px or whatever. Some people use ems. You can use ems if that's more convenient. I don't know whether percent makes much sense. I suppose you could use percents, but I usually end up just using pixels on a simple page. Ems might be smart to use, but I don't think it matters too much. So that's it. So, and I think maybe the problem that some people have is that you have to be sure that you are putting your media queries in the right order. So what we've been doing in class, and it goes against some of the main ideas that a lot of developers espouse, and I've mentioned this in class, about the idea of mobile first. And I think it's a pretty good idea. It's just that because I'm teaching this all the time, I just get used to using, the widescreen desktop version first, because that's just what students are used to creating before they enter into the realm of responsive design. So it seems to me to make sense to start with the desktop version, right? Pedagogically, it makes sense. So it doesn't really matter that much. I think it is a little better to start if you're doing professional work and you're getting into a groove, and especially if you're working with other people. I think it's probably not a bad idea to go with the mobile first. And all that means is that you're starting out creating a design for the smartphone instead of for the desktop. It's the first thing you do is the smartphone. Those rules that you create for the smartphone become your default rules, just like the rules that we create when we do a desktop version become the default rules. The wide width version of things, those rules become the default, and we go through and override those at points where we think it's advisable based upon the narrowing of the width of the browser. So I'm assuming, of course, that up here you have, a bunch of other rules that would be your standard default rules. And then when you decide that all these rules are terrific, that the desktop version of your page looks absolutely, totally cool, then you start to squeeze your page down, and maybe at 775 pixels, you feel, oh man, the content is just too wiped out, it's too squeezed in, it loses its, all its karma. So we're going to have to make some changes at 775 pixels. So it's at this point that you would then put your media query for max width 775. Then put all your rules in here and make your page look terrific at 775 pixels. Then you squeeze your page down further. Maybe it looks good at 750 pixels. Maybe it still looks good at 725. Maybe it looks good at 700. Maybe it looks good at 675, 650. Maybe at around 625 or something, it starts to get wiped out again. So at that point, you make another media query. And, it's let the page talk to you. So max width here would be, what did we say, 625? 625 pixels, and then we add our curly brackets. And then we just write all these rules that make our page look really terrific at 625. Now it may turn out, there's not too much difference between 7.25, 775, 6.25. Maybe it's just a couple things that go wacky at 625. So you may not have that many rules. Maybe at around 500, I'm sort of exaggerating the amount of query that you might need. But what am I doing here? Max. So let's say maybe at about 500 pixels, something else goes wrong. and you have to write some more rules at 500. And then maybe when it gets down to near the limit, towards the real smartphone size, maybe your 500 is going to be good all the way down, but maybe you've got a page that has a few things that are still a little weird. Maybe at 400, there may be something, one or two things that you might have to change in order to make the smartphone version look good. So you might have to change a few things there. So whatever it is, now I don't, we've got the base set of rules, and then 775, 625, 500, 400. I don't know. I've had pages where I've done that, but again, it depends on the complexity of the page. If you have a bunch of elements, and if you've got a fairly complex header, and if you've got a fat footer, and if you've got a sidebar that has extra content with images and sections and some call-outs and some block quotes and stuff, I mean, you can get a pretty complex page, and various parts of your page may go a little wacky fairly quickly, excuse me, whereas other parts of your page are going to remain pretty nice looking as they squeeze down. So anyway, the idea is to work your large version first, and then take your page and let the page talk to you. Listen to your page, watch it as you look at it in smaller and smaller size windows, and try to make adjustments that are going to help the look of the page. And you have to be sure, if you're using just max as opposed to max and min, you have to be sure that you keep this order. It's very important that when you start with your first media query, that is the largest media query if you're using max width and if you're starting from the desktop version. And then you've got to go to the next largest after that, and to the next largest after that, and to the smallest at the end. You can't move these things around. I can't grab this and cut and paste it and move the top one down to the bottom of the stack, because that may change a lot of the way the rules work. So, if you have been a little inconsistent in how you have been placing the media queries, then that could be part of the reason why you're having some trouble getting things to work. The other thing is that it's a good idea not to try to duplicate your rules. So, for example, if I had a rule up here for the body, I guess I have to have a angle bracket there. I don't know. What am I doing? I'm not writing HTML, am I? I'm just writing cascading style sheets. So if I had a rule, as I often do, margin 0 and padding 0 and so forth. You don't necessarily have to copy that. If I wanted to make some changes to the body tag down here in 775, I wouldn't use margin 0, padding 0 unless I wanted to change that. If for some reason I all of a sudden wanted to add margin or add padding, then yes, I could add those properties. But if the property and the value of the property are going to remain the same from one set of rules to another, then, there's no point in writing that rule like that. You might want to change something else in the body. Maybe you want the, font size to change a little bit. I don't know. It's not something I normally do, but, maybe you want the font size to be a little bit smaller, 95%, instead of 100% up here. If we had font size here of 100%, then yes, this is what I would do. I'd make a body rule, and I would change the font size to 95%, but I wouldn't mess with margin and padding unless I wanted to change that in some way. So if you're not going to change anything, then don't add it. This property and its value is going to be inherited by all of the media queries that run after it, as long as it's not overridden with another rule explicitly. And again, that might be some of the reason why you're having some problems. You may be thinking that this isn't the case, that these things don't inherit, but they do. So, and it's true for each individual media query. So you might not want to deal with the margin and the padding on 775 pixels, so you might want to leave that alone. But maybe for some reason on the 500 pixel, you might want to change either the margin or the padding on the body, in which case it would make sense to add that down here. So we could grab this rule and copy it and put it down here, paste it, and maybe maybe the margin stays the same, but maybe for some reason you want to add I don't know, 10 pixels of padding or something, just as an example. And maybe you want the font size to go even lower. Maybe here you just want 90%. So if this is going to be different than either or any of the media query rules up above it, then you have to explicitly change it. Okay. And if you make a rule here that says body 95%, then this then becomes the default for all the media queries underneath it. So again, this might be something that you might not understand. We have a font size of 100% for our default on the desktop version, a wide-angle version of our site. And then we set a rule for font size 95% on 775. Now that 95% is now going to be the new default for any of the media queries below 775, unless you explicitly write a rule that changes that. So down here, if you want 90%, you have to write 90%. If you want it to come back to 100%, let's say here we're going to shift to a stacked version rather than a two-column version, which means we actually might have a little bit more room in our containers. So who knows? It's possible that you might want to bring that back to be actually a little larger. So if that's the case, then you have to write 100% again. You can't assume that the 100% that you started with on the desktop version is going to hold true on everything but the 775. That's not how it works. Things inherit downward when you're using this kind of a scenario where you're just using max width and you're not adding the and word keyword, and then also using a min width along with it. So I think this is the easiest way to do it. It's the most, again, parsimonious, the least amount of code. It makes the most sense. I think it's the easiest way to follow. You got 775 down to 6 1/4, down to 500, down to 400. You can see how things are rolling down. And again, if you understand that anything that you specify in terms of a selector and the specific property is going to inherit downward, then I think you'll be in good shape. So the other thing is, like I say, don't create duplications. I oftentimes you'll see me grabbing a whole long rule and copying and pasting it and putting it into another media query. But if you look a little closer, you'll find me going back over all those properties and eliminating all the ones that I want to inherit and changing only the ones that I want to modify for that particular width of the page. So I hope that explains some of what might be a problem to you. If we're using mobile first, then the same kind of a thing can be used. It's just that we reverse stuff. So if we're using mobile first, what we do is create the perfect look of a smartphone. So all the rules that come right at the top, which would be considered our default rules, let's say, would be defaulting towards the smartphone. And then we would have a media query that said min width. So let's say that we had the same page here that we wanted to make a change at 400 pixels. So if we were doing responsive design from the mobile first point of view, we would say min width 400 pixels as the first media query here, instead of using max width 400 as the last media query when we're starting from the top and going, smaller. When you're starting small, mobile first, and getting bigger, you use min width, and you just move up to just like you normally would logically. If you're starting at about 375 pixels here as your kind of default, then maybe at 450 or something like that, you'll want to put another media query in here, and you just min width of 400 pixels or whatever. And then after that, you'd have min width of 500 pixels, let's say, and then min width of 625 pixels, and then after that, you might have it's up to you to decide where you want your desktop to kick in, at 900 pixels, mid 900 pixels or something like that would be like your large size, and and that would be the end of your string of queries. So, but the way we've been doing it so far in class has been starting with the desktop version, because like I say, that seems to make the most sense. So do your default stuff, and then just, like I say, let the page squeeze down and just notice what you think is wrong in every different part of the page. And you don't have to wait. If something is getting out of whack and you think, well, gosh, I don't know what to do because it's just the header that looks so weird, but can I make a media query and just change the header? Yeah. You can make as many media queries as you want. What a lot of people do is start out with the base, what they might consider to be the base media queries, just to get the fundamental aspects of the page set. So you might just, again, on a simple page, you might have the default, and you might have maybe two other, main media queries for something that's sort of middle-sized and something that's small-sized. Then they will sometimes go back and refine things and maybe add a few other media queries here and there to just fine-tune certain specific little things that seem to get a little out of whack, that don't quite match up with the fundamental media queries that they originally created. So they could end up with, who knows, 5, 6, 7, 8 different media queries, but maybe only a couple of them would be, the ones that had fundamental changes. The others might just have 1 or 2 rules inside them, which again, be perfectly fine, perfectly good to do that. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a deeper understanding of what we can do with media queries. I'm going to take a quick break here, and then we'll dive into looking at the Swiss Alps page, and I'll go over what we did to set it to fix real quick, and then I'll go over what I would do to create the responsive version. All right, people, I am back, and I think we'll follow through and see if we can figure out how we ended up with such a beautiful page here for the Swiss Alps page. I did this one over again. You can see I used a different font than I think what we used in class, and I messed around with it a little bit. But this is the static fixed width version. So you can see here, it squeezes down a little bit because I've used max width on the wrapper, but other than that, you can see that it really falls apart completely, other than, the accordion functionality of the wrapper. So let's take a look at the code. Maybe you remember us doing this. So like I say, I won't go over this in painful detail. Although, you know me, I love to talk, put a microphone in front of me, and I tend to just ramble on. But I'll try not to do that. All right, so here's our Swiss Alps page in the static version. We've got the doc type, of course. Of course, we've got the HTML, the head, the meta char set UTF-8. Now remember, line 5 is crucially important. We cannot emphasize enough the fact that you must have this meta tag with name, viewport, content width equals device width. Now, you don't necessarily have to have the min scale and the initial scale, but I like to put all this stuff in there just to be absolutely sure. This says that, you can't make it bigger, you can't make it smaller, and you're starting at 1. So you can't go wrong, I think, if you use this meta tag on all the pages that you're going to have responsive design with. So, and of course, nowadays, if you want to be with it, all your pages, no matter what you're doing, has to be responsive. Of course, we have the title with Responsive Web Design Swiss Alps. And just to make it easy, so I don't have to jump back and forth, I again am putting styles right inside the HTML page. It's my normal modus operandi that you guys are probably familiar with by now. And of course, you know that this is not the way that you do it if you were going live with a real website. You would want to cut out all of this stuff and put it in an external CSS file, and then just use the link element inside the head to link all of your pages to that particular external file. So, but this makes it easier to look at. So we have, standard kind of stuff. I always put margin and padding 0. Let me move this over so it's nicer looking. Margin and padding 0 on the body is something that I usually add. You can see that I've got independent rules for background color, background image, background repeat. I did that just to show you that these are actually separate elements, I usually just use background. And you can put all this stuff together in one rule, right? If you just use background colon instead of background color, background image, and background repeat, usually what I do is first put the color, and right after the color, I put the URL, and then right after that, I put the repeat X. So I'm sure you've seen me do that in the past. Sometimes this is a good way to do it if you are using responsive design and you're in a situation where you may want to adjust one of these independently. In that case, it might not be a bad idea. If you're going to, change the repeat based upon a smaller or larger size or something, then to have this as an independent rule might actually be more convenient. But generally speaking, I think that the best way to do it, as always, is to be parsimonious and use the fewest number of characters that you can in your code. Each one of these characters, that R right there, and that G, and that B, even that the blank space there, actually takes up a little bit of kilobyte space. Not too much, but if we can cut down on the number of characters in our code, then we are making our pages lighter weight, and that will download faster. People will see the wonderfulness of our pages much quicker, and everyone will be happy. Don't I wish? All right, so we have font size set to 100%. That's just sort of the base font. I decided to go with Baskerville for font family. I almost always just use sans serif fonts, but thought I'd change this around. Gives it a little different look. So this is one of those built-in font stacks that you get from Dreamweaver. So it's not the kind of font family stack that I would normally use. I'd be using a web font stack probably if I was going to go live, but this isn't too bad looking. And of course we have our super duper change the box model rule. The asterisk, remember, is the selector that selects every single little itsy bitsy element on our page and makes all of those elements have a border box sizing. And of course that just means that when we're floating things, that's where it comes in most importantly. We don't have to worry about adding padding and borders and having that mess up the floats. We don't get float drop. We can still get float drop. This doesn't solve everything, but it will solve, 75-80% of the problems that we have with float drop by just using box sizing border box. So it's always a good thing to do, I think. And we have the good old wrapper. Again, this was an older page. I decided to go with the width that fit the images. So we're going with a max width of 980. If I was doing this for real, I would probably go at around 1200 pixels or so. That's 1200 is kind of my standard, wrapper width these days for desktop size. Margin 0 auto, of course, is our normal little margin trick that gives us equal margins on the left and the right, and that centers our content. Using max dash with width gives us the percentage like accordion functionality to the wrapper. Adding background color white is important because I think we had a dark color here for the background color, that dark blue-gray, and of course it's going to wipe out all the text unless we change the background where most all the text is to white, so that's important. And also we changed the position to relative. Remember, relative positioning, the way that we set it up here, if all you did was just say position relative, absolutely nothing would happen with the element that you've added that to. It doesn't make any difference to the look or the feel of that particular element. What it does do is it gives a positioning component to any elements that are inside of that element that we set to a position of absolute. So this is, one of the steps that we always try to use when we are thinking of using position absolute. And remember, on this page, we decided that we would probably want to revert in the small size for the smartphone to having our navigation on the bottom of the page, right in front of the footer, which is what we normally used to do before we used the hamburger hidden method for navigation. So if we do that, I thought it would be nice to actually have the navigation down here where it would normally be on the small size. And so in order to get it up to where you'd normally expect it on the large and medium size, we have to absolutely position it. So I think you probably remember that. Anyway, that is a good thing to have, a good trick to be able to use whenever you need it. The header, remember, is got a background image, and we looked at the size of the image inside the assets panel, and it said that it was 275 pixels tall. We're using, to start with, the banner_large JPEG. So we want to give the height of the image to the header, because the header, if it's a background image, doesn't sense this image. It doesn't have a feel for how big that image is. So we have to specify the height for the header. If it was an inline image, it would be no problem. We just pop the image in there and the header automatically expands in width and in height to accommodate the banner. But we're using this as a background image, and the background image doesn't work like that. And we're setting the background position to start from the right and move to the left. And I feel sometimes that that's a nice thing to do, because we're squeezing the browser down from the right and moving it to the left. So sometimes it works nicer to have a background position for a large header element automatically set to the right. And then this is the vertical dimension, and we want this to go to the very top, so we're using 0. For the main, we simply have a little bit of padding. 0 on the top and the bottom, and 1em on the left and the right. That gives us a little bit of room. This room here is pretty much, I think, that are responsible for that M, the negative space that you see here running down, is responsible for that space, and that's a good thing. So main padding. Normally I would put padding on the wrapper, but if you put padding on the wrapper, then and you have a background image, then sometimes that messes up the image. So I decided to put the padding, left and right padding, on the main. Didn't want to have any padding on the top and bottom. So then welcome is simply the container that we use for the H1 and the paragraph. So welcome and H1 are inside that. Another thing that I can't remember if I talked about this to you guys or to my beginning class, but inside Dreamweaver, there's a really nice panel called the DOM panel, the DOM panel, and it's really pretty cool. It gives you a readout as to exactly what elements you have on your page. So it gets kind of like a automatic outline of all the HTML. And if you can see here that we've got the HTML, we've got the head, meta tag, both of them for the UTF-8 and for the responsive. When you click on these guys, you can see down at the bottom in the Properties Inspector, it gives you the attribute values. And if you don't have your Properties Inspector Properties panel visible, remember that you can go up to the window and go down to Properties and click there. And when that comes on, it usually just pops in right in the middle of your interface. But if you drag it down until you see that long blue line and let go, then it kind of welds itself right into the bottom of your interface there. And it's particularly good to use to add images to your page. And it's also good to get any kind of information on different elements. You can see here when I click on a different element in the DOM panel, we get a readout of what the value is for that particular property. So it's pretty cool. I click on title, you can see responsive web design. And style, of course, no, it's not going to tell us what the style is because it's too much. And then if you spring for the body and the wrapper, you can see all this stuff. And you can see how you have set it up in terms of parent and child elements. So it's pretty cool. It's really very nice. And the other cool thing is that you can use this as a way to visualize where things are on your page. So, you know, if you're trying to figure out where welcome is, just click on the section for .welcome and bingo, it will automatically show up and tell you exactly what is inside there. So you can see that that includes the large welcome H1 and that paragraph. And you can click on just the paragraph or just the H1. And inside the paragraph, there's that little inline A tag as well. So that's in there. So this is pretty nice. So you can click on the section that has all the promos, and then you can click on the individual promo 1, promo 2, promo 3, and then inside there, we've got another section called content, and we've got the H2 and the paragraph. And there's 2 paragraphs actually. One is just regular, and then this paragraph also has an A tag. So it's really neat. And it gives you a ton of information about what you've done and where you're going with the HTML structure of your page. So I like it. I like it a lot. You know, it never struck me that this was useful. You know, I thought, well, okay, so that's fun. You know, there's a DOM thing there, but I never really considered looking at it too closely. But I'm starting to use it a lot now, so it's just a real convenience to see where you're at with your page. And I think that it works inside the code view too. When you click on these things, you can jump right to the code that represents the different elements if you are in the code view. So again, that is terrific. If you're wondering, you know, where that promo 1 starts, well, it's right on line 172 here. So, pretty cool. All right, let's continue. So we talked about the header, about the main, about the welcome. Now, the welcome, we have a top margin of 60 pixels, and that's because we had to make room for the navigation, right? So this navigation is not really a part of the code. You know, the H1 doesn't see this navigation up above it because it's not up above it, it's down below. So we have to add this extra space on top of the welcome area in order to clear some room for the navigation. So I hope that makes sense to you. And let's see, what else do we have here? We've got the H1 itself, setting that to a particular size and color. We have our logo element, that we are setting to a position of absolute. And the logo is inside of the wrapper, of course, because I think everything is inside the wrapper. So since we set the wrapper to have a position of relative, that means that the logo, when we set it to position of absolute, has a reference point when we talk about the top and the right or the bottom and the left offsets of wherever the wrapper is. So in other words, when we want to position the logo to a particular part of the page, we can say top 25 pixels, and it's going to be 25 pixels down from the top of wherever the top of the wrapper is. And when we say right 32 pixels, it's going to put the logo 32 pixels to the right of wherever the farthest right edge, 32 pixels to the left, excuse me, of the farthest right edge of the wrapper. So that is cool because the wrapper extends all the way up to the very top of the page and all the way across. So essentially what we're doing is setting this basically to, you know, the full extent of the page at the top. And we're also setting the width. Might as well set the width of this div to just what we need. And we looked in the assets panel and saw that the width of this large logo here, going logo underscore large, was 150 pixels wide and 85 pixels high. In fact, if you roll over that, you can see it actually says that, 150 by 85 right down below there. So that means that the logo is sized perfectly to contain just that element, and we're setting it to exactly where we want it based upon the edge of the wrapper. And up here, we're setting the display to block position absolute. We're setting background position because this logo is inside the div. So it's actually a background div. It's not an inline div. So it's a background image. So we're just setting the background position to 0, 0. You really don't need to do that because it's the default and because the width and the height are exactly the size of the image. So if I left this out, it wouldn't make any difference. If I left out the repeat, probably wouldn't make any difference either because, again, the element that the image is inside of can only contain one example of this. So we probably could get rid of this if we wanted to. I'll leave it in there just for sentimental reasons. Then we have the promo area itself. Now, if we look at the HTML again, we have header here with the logo div. Remember, that's nothing in there. That's why we use the background image. We have the main element that contains everything after that welcome area all the way down to the beginning of the nav. It does not include the nav. And it does not include the footer. So basically the main includes all of those promotional sections. And then we have a section called Welcome for the welcome area with the H1 and the paragraph, the inline anchor tag. And then we have a section that comprises all of the promotions. So I gave this, and I have probably, one too many container elements here. I've got an overall section that surrounds all of these promotional areas. You can see down here. It ends on line 195. So that is all encompassing. It encompasses all three of those promotional cards, is what I like to call them. And then within the promotional section, the general section, we divide that up into three parts. But what I did was add a div called promo and called one. I've got a double class here. And then I also added a section with a class of content. Now, probably not necessary to do that. If I was doing this page without thinking about some other things that I might want to do later, I would probably just create a section called promo space one and leave it at that. But I think the reason why I did this was because I was thinking that we could take this page and transform it then into a Flexbox example page. And in order to use Flexbox most appropriately, remember I was saying that one of the disadvantages of Flexbox is that sometimes you have to add maybe an extra container element or so in order to give you the ability to create a flex display going either in the row or the column direction. So I think that was my plan here. I don't know if I'll end up using this as a Flexbox example. Maybe I will. I haven't done the Flexbox video yet. I'm planning it out, but I haven't really completed it yet. But anyway, so, you know, it's not, maybe it's not ideal because I keep telling you that you should use as few elements as possible. But since I did this, I did take advantage of it. What I did was, might strike you again, it's a little weird. I added for this div container, that's the one that I use the background image for. So the background image is a background image of the div promo element. It's not a part of the section that actually has the content. So again, maybe that's a little weird because we're using a background image and then for an element that doesn't have any other content except the background image, aside from the fact that it also encloses this section with a class of content. I'm sure I'm confusing you, but anyway, there's a difference between using a background image on the section that holds the content and using a background image on the div that surrounds the section. And hopefully you can, as we go through, you can see, you know, how I'm using that. And I'm not sure it's much of an advantage, but the only difference is that instead of when I'm creating some space in order to make room for the background image, normally I would use padding, right? If I had the background image set as a background image to the content section, then, you know, I'd put the background on the top left or something, and then I would use padding, right, in order to push all this content away from the background image so that the text wouldn't run right over the background image. But when the background image is in a separate container, what I did was end up using margin to create that extra space. So that was the main difference. I thought, a different way of doing it, and maybe it confuses you, but I just wanted to do something a little different to show you that you could play around a little bit more with these things. Plus, you know, the whole thing, like I say, began with the idea that I wanted to have an extra container for the sake of later Flexbox. Anyway, so we have this outer container, promo and one. Promo is the consistent class that is the same for all three of these, and then the one and the two, and you guessed it, the three are the individual class names that specify the individual sections. And then inside that we have the section called content. We have the H2 paragraph, and then a separate paragraph, two different paragraphs. The second paragraph just has the anchor tag. So this is our card, right? This is our reusable pattern, style pattern that we can cut and paste and pop anywhere on our page once we get it set up the way we like it. So I've got 3 of those, and with 3 different names and some different Latin text and 3 different background images. And then we close the section and we close the overall promotional area. And then down below, where the nav would go, if we started with mobile first and just had a static page where everything was stacked, the navigation would show up exactly where we want it to, down at the bottom of the page, right on, above the footer area. And again, I just have the normal nav with the unordered list items, and the A tags, just like we always do. And then a simple little footer with a paragraph, and then a small tag inside the paragraph, and the end of the wrapper, end of the body, and end of the HTML. So, it's pretty simple, and the page looks pretty nice, huh? You've seen this before. So we have rollover effects, as overline, and we try to take the colors from the photograph that we started with in class. And remember, the main strategy for turning this into responsive is to try to make the card elements easier to deal with as the width gets tighter. And one of the main strategies that we talked about and that we used in class was to take the image that we now have on the side of the content area and put the image on top instead. That way we're not really saving that much, because this is such a small page and we haven't used much negative space anywhere. So this page is very fragile in terms of responsiveness. It doesn't have a lot of give built into it. If I were doing this page again myself for a real site, I would probably add more negative space. Everything here is pretty tight, and it's pretty narrow to begin with, because we've only got 980 pixels to work with instead of 1200 or more. So it's not going to last too long as we start to squeeze it. What I tried to do was to push my luck a little bit and go a little bit further than I normally would in terms of squeezing this down. Even at this desktop size, these promos actually look a little bit crimped, to be honest. But you have to, again, take into consideration that normally the page would be a whole lot wider. So anyway, I have a page that I just got done doing. I changed the code around just a little bit as I was going through it, but it looks basically about the same. But now this page is pretty nice looking. It's not perfect, but it's pretty cool. So as we squeeze her down, you can see that at some point we shift the images, right? That was one of the things we did in class. So I think I had a media query at 775. You can see right up here, and you'll look as I'm moving. At 775, right there, you can see how it shifts. And I really didn't do too much. I didn't change the card area. I did change the card area. That's right. I put the cards on top. And I'm not sure whether that looks the greatest. Again, it's sort of in the eye of the beholder. I had the cards centered, and I didn't like that. I had the cards and the headings centered, and I didn't quite like that. I had the cards way over to the left. I didn't know. I didn't really like anything. I was playing around with it. So I just sort of offset the background images a little bit. I don't know. I think it looks okay. But anyway, the thing that we did, if you remember, was, we've got three different images for the banner. We've got a large, medium, and a small banner. We also have large, medium, and small logo. So at 775, that was the basic thing I did. I shifted the logo in the banner. Also, when we do that and we have a banner that's not quite as tall, we have to move the navigation area, right? Because the navigation area is absolutely positioned. It doesn't automatically ride up when it sees that there's more room to go up. So I had to manually position the nav area and push that up. And otherwise, the big thing was to change the configuration of our patterned cards by taking the image and from the left-hand side and popping it in the top, putting it up above, and fairly easy to do by simply adding, in this case, margin instead of padding on the top of the content areas. The image pretty much just popped right up there. And if we look at the code, you can see what I did. So if we go down here, what were we talking about in terms of the code? You can see here I have the, I really didn't go through the entire code in the fixed width. We had the promo here set to a width of 33 1/3%, and everything floated left. And I had some padding left of 3/4 of an M, not too much because it just wasn't enough lot of space to keep these things apart. And I had the heading set to a particular size, color, and I set that to have a pretty minimal top and bottom margin because I wanted the heading and the paragraph to stay pretty close together. So I've got actually the same margin for both the headings and the paragraphs inside of the promo areas. I have a margin of just 0.15 of an M on the top and the bottom and 0 on the left and the right. And that allows the elements to hang together. So you've got the heading here, and then you've got the paragraph, and you've got the second paragraph here. So they're not spaced so far apart that they look weird. And again, nice idea to try to take advantage of limited space by, keeping the margins a little on the conservative side. So anyway, that I think that looked pretty good. Again, you can change that around if you like more margins. I don't think you want to make it any closer than that. And then the content, which is the H2 and the paragraph, but not the background. We set a margin on the top of 10 pixels. And here's the important thing. We had a margin of 65 pixels on the left. And that's what allowed us to create size, to create some space on the left-hand side for the background images to sit right next to the headings and the paragraphs. We made the A tags maroon there, and we have an overline for hover. And here's where I just positioned the background images a little bit. So this is the horizontal offset. I moved the images in 8 pixels from the left, and I pushed it down 10 pixels. And again, you could change that. We're still talking about the desktop version here. So, um, I pushed these down. You still could go down more if you wanted these things to be even with the top of the headings. You could push the images down more. But I had it there and it looked too neat. I kind of like it when it's a little off kilter. I think that it doesn't look bad, but depending upon how obsessive compulsive you are, you can just add a little bit more. In order to change that, you would add more to the second value, right? The first value is the horizontal, and the second value is the vertical. So, where is it here? So the promo background. So this is the vertical. So if you wanted it, I don't know, maybe something like 15 pixels might get that down to even. See how that comes down? Maybe a little bit more, maybe about 17. 17 maybe? Maybe 18. Yeah. So I don't know if that's more to your liking. It's okay. And if you wanted to pull that in, I guess we could push that over a little bit too. Maybe that would give us a little bit more room, give us the illusion. So this is how far it's going from the left, pushing it to the right from the left margin. So I don't know, could we get away with 10? Yeah, that cozies it up. Maybe that gives the text on the adjoining card areas a little bit more room to play. So maybe that's not a bad idea to do. That will give us a little bit more room, because this is just so tight to begin with. And if we save a couple pixels, we're doing okay, I guess. Yeah, that could be good. So maybe I'll change that to 10 pixels and 17 pixels. Remember, the first value of background position is horizontal. Second is vertical. You can think of it as being in alphabetical order if you get confused. H before V. And then background, no repeat. And then this is the individual elements. I don't have to put .promo.1. I can just put .1. But I thought it was more, informative to use both. But it's all I needed was .1. And this is the individual promo 1 image, promo 2 image, promo 3 image. They're all 60 by 60 pixels. And that's why the content I have set here is 65 pixels. So we have a little bit, 5 pixels extra in the container element itself. So, and then the footer gave just a teeny bit of padding, made the footer color text white. The footer has got that dark blue text align center. Add a little bit of letter spacing like I like to do on a simple footer area. And then remember, we had it small inside the paragraph that's inside the footer. I made that set to 95%, so just a little bit smaller text. And then we have this CF, which is the clear fix. And the clear fix is there because we have a container that has a bunch of floated elements, and the container won't, understand where those floated elements are unless we do this kind of a clear fix. That's why I have on the promos, I've got that inside the HTML down here, I've got the CF for this class. This is the overall section that contains all three of these, but all three of these are floated, right? So if you've got entirely floated content inside of a parent container element, the parent doesn't understand, can't see its offspring. So this section is totally useless unless we set a CF clearfix to it. As it turns out, I thought I was going to use this to, put a background color on it, but I didn't. So actually, as it stands right now, it probably doesn't matter whether this section understands where its children are, because how this comes into play visually is if we put a border or a background around this class, and then you can see that it won't go around its content. And you think, wait a minute, what's happening? I added a background, but the background doesn't show up. I added a border, but the border doesn't show up. What's the deal? Well, this section is completely empty. From its point of view, it has absolutely no content. So if you put a background on this section, if you put a background on something that has absolutely no content and no, area on the page, then of course it's not going to show up. So if you put this CF class, adding this kind of a weird clearfix effect, that will automatically allow the section to understand and to see its children, even if those children are floated. So it's kind of a weird, set of properties. The CF before and CF after we're essentially creating content that's invisible, both before and after the element that we add the CF to. And we're setting the display to table, which is something that you do because of certain quirks with certain browsers. And then we're taking the invisible element that we added after, and we're setting a clear both to that. So essentially what we're doing is we're adding an invisible element after all the floated elements, and we're telling that invisible element to clear both. So essentially this is what happens when we set a clear both just on its own to the footer that we use when it gets confused, when it's right below the last floated element of columns. So it's kind of the same analogous sort of a problem, and it's solved in this way. So like I say, it's kind of weird code, but it works. So a lot of people use it. All right, then we have the nav. Of course, we know that's absolutely positioned, and it's based upon the position of the wrapper. So we have a top of 275. It's going to start 275 pixels down from the top, which is exactly how much space the header needs. So we're giving, essentially, this is like, margin or padding on the top, giving space for the banner. And we're setting the width to 100%. Now, this is something you'd say, well, if the nav is a block level element, it automatically has 100% width. But when you set it to absolute, that changes. All of a sudden, block level elements lose their innate 100% width, and they kind of shrink wrap and just create as much width as is necessary to surround the content that's inside them. So you have to explicitly give a width of 100%. And just to be sure, you have to give it a display block It doesn't lose its display property, but it's probably a good idea because there are some quirks with certain browsers and certain server mechanisms. Then we have a background color, that orangey color, and then I add a little bit of letter spacing again. And the list items, of course, we're going display inline block in order to set the navs to horizontal, and the 8 tags, white color, a little bit smaller size, 90%, 0.9 M, bold on the weight, give a line height of 1 M, transform the text to uppercase, set the margins on the right to 2 M's and on the left to 1 M, give them a little bit of space, and get rid of the text decoration, that's the underline. And then have text decoration overline, for the hover effect. So that is the state of things for the large version. And then what we wanted to do was to change that. And if you remember back to what we were just talking about earlier about media queries, not a bad idea to make a little comment here. You can put all kinds of things and dashes and asterisks and everything to beat the drum, remind yourself that this is a media query and what the max width is and everything. So I decided to go with 775 pixels as my first media query. And I decided to go with the medium banner at that point. And the medium banner is, you can see here down below the little thumbnail, is 800 by 200 pixels. So 200 pixels is the height. That means that we can reduce the height of the header from, 275 down to 200, which saves us a lot of room. And the reason why we want to use this medium banner is because it also saves a lot of file size. If someone's looking at this like in a tablet or a small laptop, they don't have to download the big image. This image is smaller and it's going to download faster. So it is an advantage. Then we have the little logo. We want to resize that. We have logo underscore medium, and the logo has shrunk down a little bit to 115 by 70. So again, we changed the height and the width of the container to exactly the same size as the image. And then I adjusted the positioning a little bit because it's smaller. I pushed it up a little more towards the top, and I think, moved it over to the right a little bit. So you can see how that works when we squeeze it down and it hits 775. Bingo, right there. It's about in the same position relative to the size of the banner. So that looks pretty good. And so otherwise, for the main, I decided to reduce the top and the bottom margin of the main so that it wouldn't take up as much vertical space. Also, we want to move the nav up because we don't need to give it that 275 pixel clearance now because the banner is only 200 pixels tall. So we can set the nav top offset to 200, and that makes everything fit in nicely. For the nav A, I reduced the size of the font a little bit, I think, to 0.9. And I think I reduced the line height to 0.5 M. And I think I reduced the margin a little bit too. And here's the big thing, content. The content container is the container that holds the H2 and the 2 paragraphs. So instead of having that 65 pixel offset on the left, now I put a 70 pixel offset on the top. But again, we're using margin instead of the normal padding that we would use if it was the contents background image that we were making room for. but it's not the contents of the background image, it's the promo's background image. So those are two separate elements, and when we want to pull two separate elements apart, we want to use margin and not padding. So I just shifted that to the top, 70 pixels on the top. And then change the position of those images. We were just messing around doing that. You saw us doing that. Background position. Again, these are kind of like absolute offsets, but they're part of the background position property. And then the small, thought I'd make the small a little bit smaller, 90%. So here I've got a little thing saying, now it's the end of 776 and the beginning of what, 590. So I decided 590 might be a second spot. And again, I don't know, pushing my luck a little bit. But 775, then I'm squeezing this down, squeezing it down, squeezing it down. 675, 650, 630, 620. Oh, it's getting pretty squeaky. 600. That's pretty tight already, but I thought, well, I'll get down into the fives. 590. So at that point, I added the small banner and logo. So, let's see. Looks like my banner is a little bit off. I didn't notice that before, but it looks like this is tiling. Yeah, I didn't notice that. Yeah, because I have it set to cover. So really, it's only at 500 pixels that it's not sort of tiling. So, that's not too bad. We can fix that, but I don't want to worry about that right now. Anyway, I know that that's kind of pushing it because it's pretty squeezed in even at this point here, but I wanted to get it into the fives. So I got it down to 590 and then shifted to the small logo size here, and again reposition that a little bit, and then the small banner size. I actually increased, I think, the size of the navigation a little bit, or did I? I don't know, maybe it's just in comparison. Looks like it's a little bit bigger. No, I guess it's the same. It just looks bigger compared to the smaller banner. And again, because we were reducing the offsets, I had to push the nav up even further, and of course I had to push up the welcome as well. So everything got a little smaller. This is much more dramatic of a change for the banner size. But I did not immediately go to stacking the promo areas. I was going to, and then I thought, well, I wanted to use more than just the normal couple standard media queries. So I thought I could get away with squeezing this guy down a little bit more. So I think I waited until about 530. And then I decided, well, that's about as, when this thing rolls over here, the welcome gets pushed down. That's no good. I didn't notice that. What I can do there is, we have a little bit of offset here on the links here, and the nav links. So what I could do would be to, on the 590, I could move the entire set of navigation links over to the left. Let's do that. So I'm going to go down to the 590 version here, and well, let's look at where how we set it up originally. I don't know which one has the offsets here. Let's see, paragraphs, A tags. Where are those guys? Nav. Yeah, here. I have 2 M's of space for the A tags on the right and 1 M on the left. So, and that looks good, you know, on the other sizes. Let me copy that and bring that down to the 590 version here. And here's what the nav is here. And we want to keep the white color. We want to keep the font size, font weight. So remember I was saying you can get rid of these things because they're inherited. Line height, text transform. I think the only thing that I'm worried about is just the margin. So get rid of all these guys. And let's just do 0 here and see if that works. No, if that's going to work for right now. That still doesn't work. Let's see. Maybe I've got some, maybe I have some margin or padding on the nav element itself. Let's see. Let's go back up and see if we can find the nav. Well, we could change the other factor, the right-hand margin. Just get everything a little bit closer. I don't want things to get too close, but let's try just 1 M here. See if that works. See, that contracts all of the links here. I just want to get it so that it doesn't wrap around before it hits. Okay, that's good. All right, that does the trick. Yeah, that actually looks fine. So it doesn't wrap. So at 530 then, I jump to stacking, right? And that's usually the final move that you want to make. Set the stacking. Set to stacking when you get real narrow. So we have the banner on top. We have the navigation jumps down below. And I didn't spend a lot of time doing the navigation here. You know, you could play around with it and make it look prettier. But I just put some borders around it and stacked it. And again, because we got rid of the nav, we have a lot of extra space here. So I eliminated some of that negative space in between the H1 and the banner. And then we have our promos stacked, but back to their original configuration, where we have the images on the left-hand side and the content H1s and double paragraphs on the right. And then I put some dividers, just some border to divide those guys up a little bit. And the footer, of course, is so simple. Footer looks great. So if we squeeze this down to, let's see, what was it? The iPhone 6. If you click down here, Dreamweaver has built in, some of the iPhone, Google stuff. So if you go to the original iPhone, well, I guess the iPhone does get down to 667 if we went as far back as the 6S. But still looks good. Even at that very minuscule width, this baby looks pretty good. So, not a complicated page. This is the nice thing about this page, is that, it's got a huge banner. We swapped out 3 different size images. We played around with the nav and moved it up and down based on the absolute positioning. We had just an H1 and a simple paragraph with 3 card areas and a super simple 1-line footer area. So this could have been a much more complicated page. We could have had, a column here, and the column itself could have, broken down into 2 or 3 columns down below, and then come back to 1 full one, and down to 2, and back up to, full, etc. So, if we had a more complicated page, this would be more work. But I think a lot of the same considerations would take place. So, and hopefully you get an idea of the media queries that I used. I've got, my main large size, which becomes kind of the default. You don't need a media query for that. Just start putting your large size rules in here. If you're starting from large, if you're starting from small, then you put your small size right in here. So either way, whether you're starting mobile first or you're starting with the desktop, whatever you start with, those rules, you don't need to have a media query for them. And once you start to get bigger or smaller, depending on where you're starting from, then you use @media, max width, 775 pixels. Got to make sure, too, that you are not going to miss and confuse yourself with the curly bracket that ends the media query. And that's why I have this little comment attached right behind the media query curly bracket, the ending, so that I don't mistake this for the end of the curly bracket of an individual rule. So I have my 776 rules, then I have my @media max width 590 rules, and I wrote those there. And again, tried not to duplicate anything. The only things that I have here are properties with values that are different. And then I have the end of the 950 or 590, and then the beginning of the 530. And I have my @media max width 530. And you can see I reduced the markings on the welcome. And I made the promo, I had to go back and give promo that 100% width just to be sure. Subtracted the float, added some padding because we're making it a little bit, giving it a little bit more negative space because we're stacking it, and adding that bottom border around it so that that was a little divider. And did the same thing for the, this is, again, here we got a rule for all of the promo elements. I put a bottom border, 1 pixel solid light gray. But by doing that, the first element is missing a top border, right? If we squeeze this down, you can see that there was nothing on the top here. If I put these borders on the bottom of the promo, then the first one starts here, and then here, and then here. Of course, you can't see that, which is okay. But I wanted one on the top, right? So what I did was made a special rule just for promo 1. Making sure that, I got the overall rule of promo, which selects all those elements and adds a bottom border. And then I added, just for the top one, the dot 1, I added a top border. And then I did the same thing for the navigation, because the navigation I had the same problem. For the list items, I added a bordered bottom of dotted, right? But I had the same problem. I wanted the first list item to have a dotted top to make it, look like it was, going along. So what I did there was use first child. So I got nav li colon first child, and that selected the first list item, and then I added border top of dotted 2 pixel white, and that gave me this one here right above the about us. That dotted area there wasn't there originally, just like the top light gray wasn't there above promo 1. So sometimes, you have to add things, and, those special selectors sometimes come in handy. This is actually oftentimes the only time that I use these things is when I have to grab something for this kind of a reason, where I'm doing something in series, but the first one or the last one that you do, somehow, however you've got it set up, it doesn't get the effect that the other ones are getting. So using first child or last child, you can grab the first or the last element in a series and give it a special characteristic. And then for the A tags, we made those white and made the size bigger because people are going to be using their finger to click on those, make it bold, and get back a little bit more of the line height. So that is basically it. Basically the whole shebang. And like I say, it works pretty good. The styling could be better, if I spent more time on it, and fine-tuned it and everything. But it doesn't look too bad. Well, we did this already, so maybe you understand what's going on. And I think I put this up on the website that I talked about, the let's see, do I still have it open? Maybe I don't. Oh yeah, CodePen. Yeah, I still have that up there. Let's see. Remember I talked about CodePen. Thought I put it up there. Yeah, Swiss. I got it up there. So I have that up on CodePen. If you want to look at it, go and use the instructions that I gave you in the previous video to get up to CodePen at OpenCC. John Petrosius. Use that codepen.io/shias/project/editor/DOMAJB. And you'll be able to get right in there, Art267. Go to Swiss folder, and then go here, and you can see this is pretty cool. I've got all my images here. that's cool. And I've got the cascading style sheets. This is not actually, oh, that's right. This is not actually the page that I did. This is the page that's I got off the web. And they put their styles, oh yeah, they put their styles inside several different external style sheets. So this is actually going to end up looking, the code's going to be different from what I just did. But anyway, you might find it interesting. You can see how how someone else did the same page and the rules that they used. And if you have questions about that, you can send me a note and ask me about that. If I get a chance, I'll put the one I just did up on here too, inside the Swiss Miss folder here, inside Oakton CC on CodePen. Okie dokie. I think I've taken long enough, so I will say adieu. I'm going to make another video and go through some Flexbox stuff. And I'll put both of these up, hopefully, on Thursday. Like I said, try to mimic the class schedule that we had, where I pop a couple different things up on Thursdays. So, also, I haven't quite figured out what we're going to do with our mini projects. I think maybe by, next week, or the week after next, you should have a mini project for Flexbox. But we can talk about that next week. Send me an email if you have any questions on that. And then we'll do the CSS grid, and then we'll have a little mini project for that. And if we have any time at all, we might squeeze in just a little bit of a discussion of PHP. All right, I hope you guys are hanging in there and are staying safe. Talk to you later.